You say when, okay?
Okay.
You need to give the apology disclaimers with that story.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be starting very shortly. So we entertain just a few more minutes and we'll start. Thank you so much.
Did anybody want me to share the link? I can do that in the chat. But you should be able to hear comfortably.
Okay,
tell me if
now.
when I turn this around, tell me if you can see the screen comfortably, okay? Can you make that out?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, great. And when I'm doing mine, I'll just share my screen with you, so you'll be fine for that as well. Thanks, Nijane.
Okay, it's streaming.
It's streaming now?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You want me to go see about batteries? Is it quick?
It's I'll work with them. By the time you come, we're good. And if someone went to get your class, so. Dr. Smith? I think we should start. Dr. Smith. I think we should start.
Yeah. Oh, this is okay.
Everybody, good evening. How are you doing? Have you been enjoying Black History Month? Woo! Excellent, excellent. Before I introduce the two persons who are going to give us an absolutely great occasion today, in fact, we are going to be having an intellectual treat. I want to excite us concerning the other activities planned for this week. Tomorrow, Thursday, there is somebody in our midst who goes by the name of Dr. Christopher Williams. And he's going to be doing a lecture in the Huey Mona Faculty Graduate Seminar. It will be online. The title is The Development of Caribbean Civilization and Somatic exceptional. On Friday. Now this is going to be awesome. On Friday, I was told by Dr. Stephanie, by 10 o'clock, this area is going to be transformed in a display, right, Dr. Erica?
Downstairs on the passageway.
On the passageway, okay? And the display will be by the Arts and Business Divisions. They're going to be having information, games, and activities. By 12:30, right here in the Cascade Room, there'll be a lunch hour concert. There'll be a fashion show.
The fashion show is downstairs.
Downstairs fashion show, and here is the lunch hour concert.
Where's Glenn? It was supposed to be music room.
Where will it be?
Music room.
Music room.
Concert. The movie here.
The movie is right here, and the concert is by the music group. Okay. Now, 14 persons entered for the video competition, and during that time, we'll know who the winners are. We're asking you, everybody, don't miss these occasions. Very, very unforgettable. And please wear something African. All right? And I myself will be done in my African wear. Before I introduce the two speakers, I want to take the occasion to ask you students to please enter the UCCI oratorical competition. It's slated for March 22nd. It's being sponsored by the UCCI Debate and Oratorical Society. And the topic is, what does it mean to be human? And there are many prizes for you, so enter and be part of that. Now we come to the real thing. All right? Okay. So we have two very distinguished speakers for this evening. The first speaker will address the topic, No Apology Without Reparations, analyzing the formal apology for slavery in the Dutch Caribbean. And the speaker will be Dr. Janine Philip Durham, and Dr. Durham is the Dean of the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences. Give her a hand, please. And she will be followed by Dr. Stephanie Fullerton Cooper, Associate Professor in the Division of Humanities and the Social Sciences. And her topic is, where this come from? African worldview and its expressions in the Caribbean. Give them a hand, everybody. And while they speak to us, please write down your questions so we can have a vibrant after the lecture session. Thank you, Dr. Durham. Come along.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Dr. Liv. Certainly hope welcome, and again my presentation this afternoon is No Apology Without Reparations, a focus on the Dutch Caribbean. So I'll speak to you for about the next 20 minutes or so on the topic. So just to give you a bit of a background, is there anyone here from the Dutch Caribbean or from the Netherlands? Okay. So during the 17th century, we would have had the Netherlands as one of the most prosperous nations in the world, and that period was known as the Golden Age. So we'll get a bit into the Golden Age and why that in and of itself is and was problematic. But what that entailed was that you had a total of 600,000 people from Africa as well as Asia being trafficked by Dutch merchants between the 17th and 19th century. So a bit more history as well. The Netherlands is one of the European societies with the most direct and extensive links to slavery. So in terms of what we would be focusing on, it would be the Dutch Caribbean overseas territories. And why it is important, I think small non-independent jurisdictions such as those in the Dutch, French, Spanish, and English-speaking Caribbean, they do offer very important insights about advantages and disadvantages to be had from their status. You should know that as well, these countries tend to be, these territories tend to be traditionally more developed than their independent counterparts. And there are, of course, advantages that they derive from their integration in the models that they are in. But they are not only advantages. So we'll get into a bit more of what some of these disadvantages look like and what extended statehood arrangements look like for overseas European territories in the Caribbean, because they do conjure more questions than answers in a number of instances. So some of what we would address today would include the historical balance or imbalance of power, so that power dynamic between the Netherlands and its Caribbean overseas territories, and that would bring us eventually to an understanding of why the apology for slavery has not been wholeheartedly accepted in the Dutch Caribbean. So on this map, you would see what is referred to as the former Netherlands Antilles. So the one in the middle, well, the first one, Aruba, which is clearly outlined. The larger one in the middle is Curacao, and next to that you have Bonaire, which would have been part of the former Netherlands Antilles, and just to the top here you have Saint Martin, and of course I'm looking specifically, Saint Martin is a binational island, so you have a Dutch side and a French side. I'm focused specifically on the Dutch side. Unfortunately, before you go ahead, Dr. Erica, it's very difficult to find a map of the Caribbean where you would see Saba and St. Eustatius, which are also Dutch overseas territories. So Saba and Statia would be somewhere between St. Kitts here and St. Martin, very small Dutch overseas territories. So the discussion on decolonization in the Dutch Caribbean, and I'm jumping ahead a bit, just to share with you what the most recent and contemporary situation has been. In 2010, you would have had the referenda. The series of referenda ended in 2010, October of 2010, which caused the dismantling of the Netherlands Antilles, including Bonaire, Saba, St. Eustatius or Statia, Curaçao, and St. Martin, again, to declare the Dutch side. So what was 10-10-10, following 10-10-10, Saba, Bonaire, and Statia became public municipalities, while St. Martin and Curaçao became constituent states within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Aruba would have achieved this status since 1986. So Aruba is also, as I mentioned, part of the Dutch Caribbean, and Suriname would have attained independence long before that. Worthy to note that when Aruba attained status aparte, or a separate status similar to what Curaçao and St. Martin accomplished, the trajectory was to have been independence. Today that has not happened, and Aruba is still considered an autonomous constituent country within the kingdom. And of course you have, traditionally, you would have had a sense of mutual accommodation, whether it's French, Dutch, or the British Caribbean. And what is distinctive, I do see much of that mutual accommodation, particularly in British overseas territories. In the French overseas territories, in the Dutch overseas territories, you have very vibrant independence movements, and with the exception of the British Virgin Islands, I am not aware of vibrant independence movements throughout the British overseas territories. So the kingdom, all of that to say, there has been an ongoing tug-of-war between the Netherlands and its Caribbean dependencies since 10-10-10. And that would have predated all of that, stemming from since Aruba and that thrust towards independence. So the issues have involved governance, management, supervision of the Caribbean-based territories, which produce fragmentation. There has been a lack of policy space, and that discussion, that conversation has resurfaced in relation to, as you see, COVID-19, hurricanes Irma and Maria, and just about anything in relation to governance, or what the Netherlands considers to be bad governance. So the irreconcilable differences between insiders and outsiders, the insiders being constituents in the Dutch Caribbean, and the outsiders being those from metropolitan Netherlands. So these tensions continue today over differences in terms of their ideologies, their approaches, their priorities, and culture and identity. So just by way of example, in terms of the culture and identity, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this celebration or tradition. Does anyone know of that, Pete?
Yeah, it's really bad.
It is. So I have a short clip, but I wouldn't show the clip with Quincy Gario, whose case became quite popular because he was arrested during protests in Rotterdam, protests against the celebration of Zwarte Piet. So it basically is someone resembling Santa Claus with black-faced, not black persons, but white persons with black faces, as what you would consider perhaps elves. And those, this entire celebration, on one hand, Dutch persons consider it part of tradition, part of history, part of heritage. And of course, persons have said this is a product of colonial racism, and there's nothing that is celebratory about white persons portraying to be black helpers. So that has continued the racism, the class oppression, the gender inequality, as well as the sexism. And Quincy Gario today is still known as one of the most prominent advocates against Zwart Piet. He's from Curacao as well as represents Sint Maarten, where he grew up. So in December of 2022, Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who is the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, he would have issued an apology for slavery on behalf of the Dutch government. So this just gives you the text of what that apology, some of that apology would have looked like. And the day after, in the Dutch Caribbean, you had a well-coordinated effort to give a response to that apology from Mark Rutte. And I would go into a bit of the apology to highlight these three: the non-acceptance of the apology, the paradox of the apology amidst continued colonialism or neo-colonialism, as well as some failed promises following 10-10-10, which I mentioned when we started, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and COVID-19. Dr. Erica. So this here is the Prime Minister of Sint Maarten, Prime Minister Silveria Jacobs, and she would have led the conversation at the University of Sint Maarten on the Dutch slavery apology. Now, I have done research in the Dutch Caribbean for a number of years, and initially, when I saw my colleagues who are at the forefront of some of these independence movements saying no apology would be accepted, I said, what do they want now? This is it. This is what you've been advocating for. The apology is coming, so what now? But based on what I shared before and what I will share later, you would understand some of the tensions, the history, and just the whole colonial orientation behind that apology and why it was not accepted. So Prime Minister Silveria Jacobs, who was also the Minister of Education at one point in time, she has been, to me, one of the most outspoken ministers, one of the most outspoken members of Parliament against the overreaching of the Netherlands. And she had done this even prior to the apology coming. So this was no surprise. Her response said, I wondered how she would have managed diplomatically, because of course you're still in this union, you're still in this arrangement that you have to continue to work with. So she has said this is a matter of historic proportions and a dialogue long overdue, which affects and emotes all. And she has gone on to answer the question that I was asking myself: why mixed emotions? Because on one hand, the seriousness of the occasion, if it is sincere, is not lost on me, especially seeing the recent public statements. But the important part to note, on the other hand, the manner in which we arrive here today, it is messy, it exposes many risks in realizing true reparatory justice for those impacted by the slave trade. So that was really the sentiment that was expressed by my colleagues who are the forefront of the independence movement. There has traditionally been that mess since Aruba gained status aparte in 1986, and that has continued up until today. So it was not necessarily a case where people were not happy that an apology was forthcoming, but the backdrop against which the apology came, because it was really rushed through cabinet, there was no consultation, as you would hear. And following the apology, to your far left is Professor Hert Oostendi, who is one of the most brilliant historians on the Dutch Caribbean, on Dutch overseas territories, and the rest of his panel. And I really respect him as an academic and as a scholar. But this is exactly what is problematic about these types of situations, because you had the apology, and then it was announced that Hert Oostendi and his team, don't see anyone look like constituents from the Dutch Caribbean, who would be leading the research on the history of slavery in the Caribbean as well as in other Dutch territories. So that in and of itself was problematic, because apart from the fact there was no consultation, you have this happening, and then you put leading researchers, again, from the Netherlands. So it returned to that somewhat of a top-down approach toward finding answers to what exactly is the problem. So I'm not sure this was a strategic decision to put the KITLV and the Royal Netherlands Institute at the forefront of this investigation, but that is what happened. And the analogy that could be drawn was that you had the repetition of neocolonialism, because you do have the likes of Valika Smulders, Quincy Gario, Rhoda Arundel, so many people that could have been included in this conversation that would have represented the interests of the Dutch Caribbean, and none of them, my colleague Francio Guadalupe, who is also I need to remember this is being live streamed. Interestingly enough, also at the KITLV as a researcher, doing extensive research on slavery and trying to get slavery research and information into the curriculum, not being invited to be part of this committee. So in addition to this, just a minute, Dr. Erica. So the Dutch present themselves as global champions for human rights, as well as The Hague is seen as the capital of international law. And one of the most important tenets of reparatory justice is cessation and the guarantee of non-repetition. And you would see the repetition, not of slavery, but of colonial tendencies, of colonial overreaches by the Netherlands, and some of the rhetoric that is used in the Dutch Caribbean. So Quincy, in response to the apology, has also said most people understand that the Golden Age is a wrong term, but at the same time, how do we redress the harm, the systems that were built in? So throughout the Dutch Caribbean, you have in St. Martin, for example, where English should be the primary level of instruction in the secondary schools. You have Dutch schools, you have technical schools, you have vocational schools, and the system is somewhat, obviously, it's a Dutch overseas territory, Dutch laws, the Dutch police service. So you kind of filter out who has access and who does not, who has access to some of the jobs, who has access to the important roles in the Netherlands. And of course, you have, you can go ahead, Dr. Erica. So you have the return of some of these colonial tendencies. So the first one, in the aftermath of 10-10-10, important to note, in both Curacao and St. Martin, they would have attempted to have approval for consecutive budgets. And they would have been, so the CFT was implemented by the Netherlands after the dismantling. So it was kind of a supervisory board. And in the words of Minister Plastic, who was at the time the State Secretary for Interior Affairs and Kingdom Relations, this is the most, this is not the most prestigious role that any minister can get. So that in itself as well, the relations between the Netherlands and this minister and the islands, you can see that play out in the public domain. So he had responded in relation to the CFT, saying it was in the best interest of the countries. Whether they felt the same there, clearly that was not the case at the time of the post-autonomous situation. So you had excessive supervision both in St. Martin and Curacao against the backdrop of corruption. So this speaks to the Dutch government's justification for commissioning. They would have had a number of integrity reports, at least 3 at that time. So now I think it's beyond 5 integrity reports continuously being commissioned. And this person was saying integrity, or rather the lack thereof, is a severe problem in St. Martin, and the recent integrity report showed that ministers had not acted in good faith. And the last part, which is really the language that you would see in relation to, in that relationship between the Netherlands and the Caribbean overseas territories, they are saying it has nothing to do with colonialism and damage is being done to the kingdom, and it's our task to protect it. We will not tolerate that the kingdom is hijacked by St. Martin, and the politicians should not be surprised that that instruction was given. So that is very commonplace in the Dutch Caribbean. Instructions, coercion, that sort of encouragement to behave well. So one of my colleagues would have said They have spent so much money on integrity reports here, but we continue to beg for structural funding for the University of St. Martin, which is the national university. So the monies that could have gone into structural funding of the university would have gone to continuous commissions of these integrity reports. So this was one of the failed promises, to be able to allow for greater autonomy. That was the essence of 10-10-10, for increased autonomy, and instead there was increased and excessive supervision. And this is one of the most noteworthy examples. I think this, all over the world, people became aware of this situation, and I think following Hurricane Irma, St. Martin would have gone through 3 or 4 prime ministers, and a lot of it had to do with tensions, again, between the Netherlands and the Caribbean overseas territories. So following Hurricanes Irma, the situation was used as a pretext to resume those kinds of behaviors. So this again is Silveria Jacobs, Prime Minister Silveria Jacobs. So this started with the first Prime Minister, William Marlin. The government collapsed. Leona Marlin Romeo became the Prime Minister. Similar situation, could not find a comfortable agreeing point with the Netherlands to administer the funding for recovery. And then we went on to, I can't remember who was the interim Prime Minister in St. Martin, but needless to say, Irma presented the opportunity for that big stick approach to resume once again. So Prime Minister Silveria Jacobs, which you're seeing on the right-hand side, she is saying, historically, with regard to exercising our own agency and self-determination within the Dutch kingdom structure, we've been in the position to exchange colonial obedience for aid and loans. And that has been this nicely sums up the history of that relationship. So after Hurricane Irma, this resurfaced, and you can go right ahead. And they continue to be punished for colonial disobedience. Again, you had with COVID-19, this once again resurfaced, and Coho became a major fiasco as well, because this was an institution that was created again to manage, monitor, punish, withhold resources from the overseas territories, and conditionalities which we had experienced in the post-independence era in the rest of the Caribbean. Those returned in the Netherlands Antilles during COVID-19. So you had liquidity loans being made available, but the conditions for granting those loans became very bizarre. So every so often you would hear a new conditionality added to what was supposed to happen within the context of Coho and the reform entity. So you went from the Integrity Commission following 10-10-10, then you had Coho, and a host of other institutions and policy measures that were being foisted upon the communities in the Dutch municipalities, which would be the Bonaire, St. Eustatius and Saba, as well as the constituent states. So the conversation, of course, is that you can't have a conversation on reparations without consultation. There was no consultation. So this is why, and you would see based on the history and the trajectory, why that consultation is important, and why in the first place people have said, no, this is just simply a continuation of that kind of behavior. We are giving you reparations and it is on our own terms. So they had already outlined what the reparations would look like with no consultation throughout the Dutch Caribbean. So in response to that, I think this was the Dutch Caribbean's moment, not really to strong arm, but to use their agency. Because from what you would have seen, they have been robbed of that agency. Policy space had been curtailed historically, and this was the moment for them to say, no, we have reparations and we have it on our own terms this time around. So the consultation with relevant stakeholders and discussions led by the Caribbean for the Caribbean would be what one of the asks, autonomous policy making and increased agency, climate reparations in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Went to St. Martin last year, there was no significant improvement. Same thing, changes in government, changes in administration, changes in the behavior from the Netherlands. So, and of course it's in the hurricane belt, very prone to natural disasters and climate related events. So the reparations this time around would have to come without the conditionality. That was one of the requests. Structural and sustained funding for education. Today there's no law on higher education, so the University of St. Martin still has no structural funding. The only university in the Dutch kingdom without structural funding. Constitutional reform. So based on the Kingdom Charter 1954, all countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands should be equal. That has not been visible, it has not been apparent since then, and it continues to be that way. And of course, for those of you who would have been following the conversations on reparations, you would have seen Sir Hilary Becker's, through CARICOM's response, basically saying, again, this consultation has to be on our own terms. The reparations discussions, we have to set the framework for that. And the CARICOM 10-point action plan on reparations, as well as debt cancellation, because there is some debt throughout the Netherlands, Caribbean Netherlands. So following or adhering to much of what is enshrined in the 10-point CARICOM plan, those were some of the discussions. So the apology was not accepted based on the historic relationship between the Netherlands and its overseas territories, and I suppose unless and until those conversations can be opened up to allow for more understanding. There's a lack of understanding and a lack of awareness. One of the conversations in the Netherlands when they did the polls to determine persons' response to the apology, many of the responses were history is history, and that is the public sentiment a lot of the times on that side of the Atlantic. So for us to move beyond that history is history rhetoric, it would require much consultation, and then I suppose the apology we can move toward a full acceptance of that apology. So that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Durham, Dean of the Division. And for those who came a bit late, our next presenter is Dr. Stephanie Fullerton Cooper, and her topic is where this comes from, African worldview and its expressions in the Caribbean. Please give her a hand, everybody.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I am just waiting for my presentation to come up, but while I'm waiting, just to acknowledge the presence of all of you here. Thank you so much for being here. Special thanks to Ms. Shirley from UWI. We're always happy to welcome you. Love to have you join us. And I want to mention to my past student, the gentleman I called my son, Lloyd Barker, whom I consulted for something legal, and he just showed up and surprised me, so I'm happy to see him. I encourage my current students to keep in touch even after this as well, please. All right, have you found it? Yes. I have students online. Welcome to those who are online as well. I'm talking about where this comes from. And notice that I have cast it in the Jamaican lingua, patois, and that's deliberate. I'm going to explain why later on. While I'm waiting for that to come up, just to say that we're really looking at Africa, the African worldview, and how it is expressed in the Caribbean. Some of the behaviors, practices, beliefs that we have in the Caribbean, we don't know where they originated, and quite a bit of them actually originated from Africa. And so one of the things I want to start by saying is almost a disclaimer. A lot of what we do in the Caribbean is an amalgamation. Last time Dr. Williams spoke about creolization, he spoke about syncretism, the synthesizing, coming together of various countries, nationalities, and how it has impacted us here. So we are not, maybe only you, Mr. Enanga, we are not many of us 100% authentic African, but we certainly do have He's our resident African, so I have to single him out. This whole idea Jamaica puts forward, out of many, one. Have you found it? Not coming up? I can use my own, it's just that I didn't want to lose my students there. Don't use it. I can continue chatting. So, out of many, one. I want to start by saying I'm focusing on the African connections, but I'm acknowledging that it's not just Africa that has impacted what we do here in the Caribbean. I also want to say that I'm focusing a lot on Jamaica, because that's where I come from, because that's where I'm from, right? But I know that there are several persons in the audience from different Caribbean countries, and I invite you at the end to please say how this might be expressed in your own country. The other thing I try to do is to incorporate a lot of statements from persons from various parts of the Caribbean. So you should still somehow hear multiple voices. So one of the things that is believed is when the Africans were taken from their home and brought across the transatlantic slave trade, experienced the Middle Passage, they lost their memory. Oh, they lost their African connections, their culture. And by the time they got here to the New World, they had been so overwhelmed by everything else that they experienced that there's no true authentic expression. And a lot of what we see is a state of historylessness because it's not true, it's not authentic of Africa. Edward Kamau Brathwaite, who is a Bajan poet and academic, he said that this is actually not so. What we actually see is that as the Africans were transported, their culture came with them. And we see these expressions today in the African retentions, in the sayings, the proverbial expressions, in our dances or religious expressions, etc. So for today, I'm focusing largely on religion and I'm focusing on language. But what happened when we had this kind of cultural mixing is that when they came to the Caribbean and they were the Africans' religious expressions, their beliefs, etc., were amalgamated with that of their colonizers, there's this idea that because I'm the colonizer, mine is dominant. Because I'm the colonizer, yours is inferior. And so one of the things that happened throughout slavery is the stereotyping of blacks' religious expressions as inferior, their language as inferior, etc. So that's something we're going to be looking at as well. The people's identity, their sense of self, who we are, what it is that we believe, all of that became trivialized, became inferior. And so even today, we see a lot of persons in the Caribbean still believing that some of what defines us is less than the ideal. It's not quite authentic, it's not quite acceptable. It is this stereotyped version, and in a lot of ways we feel inferior as a result of that. So when we look at the African worldview, what exactly is that? The African worldview speaks to the Africans' concept of the world, speak to their epistemology, their belief system. What is it that they believed? What is it that they practiced? And how do we see that expressed today? When we look at the African worldview, we realize that at the very center of the African worldview is religion. For the Africans, religion isn't a separation, like with Christianity, of the spirit and the flesh. It's an interconnection of all things. So there is a manifestation of God in nature. There's a manifestation of God in people. In everything, there is some expression of God. And when we look at this and we consider it, then there is no separation between African religion, African philosophy. All of what we see as aspects of African culture can be found in its religion. And one of the things you should be seeing are some nice quotations from various persons all over, like I said before, that would be speaking to, thank you, that would be speaking to the various academic voices on this. So if you go all the way down to where it says religion. Yes. So this is an interesting concept that's put forward by this Guyanese historian and author, Bisnorth. He said that the general view of the English planters was that African slaves did not hold to a system of beliefs that could be described as a religion. They didn't have religion. What they have was superstitious mumbo jumbo. What they had amounted to nothing more than heathen superstition. And this is how it was stereotyped. Because, of course, there has to be superiority, and likewise, there has to be inferiority. Continue, please. So we see that in the Caribbean, there are various ways in which the African religion is expressed. Mervyn Allain said that what actually happened is there was a constant revitalizing of the African religion. Every time a new boat or ship of Africans came, they injected something new into the activities. And so there was this constant revitalizing of religions. Throughout the African religion, we see through these preoccupations with healing, spirit possession, obia, Mayalism, drumming, masking, all we should be able to relate to in the Caribbean. These are the various ways that the Africans would express their religion. Dr. Chris spoke to obia, so I won't spend too much time on it. But of course, I don't think there's anybody in the Caribbean who doesn't know about obia. Yes? But when we look at the African worldview and look at how it all started, it's actually in Africa, known in Ashanti, known as Obaifo, that's the African word for it. And it was actually having both benign and malign associations. In other words, obia wasn't just bad, like we believe it now to be. In some of the cultural expressions in Africa, there were some good things about obia. For example, it was used for healing, to cure, to exorcise. And we see that expressed quite a bit in the Caribbean now, especially through such religious expressions as kumina. I don't know if you guys know about Mayalism, which is a cousin to obia, but it's said to be kind of the more positive connotations of it. But in truth, when we look at obia as it was expressed in Africa, it really wasn't only negative. There were some positive connotations as well. When we think about African religions, we had I'm going to say obia man, but I'm going to use it more so the witch doctor or the medicine man, right? And healing was an integral part of African religious expressions. And this healing wasn't just of the physical, but there was healing too of the spirit. So we talked earlier about exorcism, driving out bad spirit. These are expressions you hear all over the Caribbean. So when we think about the African traditional medicine, it is a holistic kind of health that Africans would practice, because the healing wasn't just of the physical, but of the spiritual as well. And we certainly see that there are lots of expressions of herbalism, right? So in the Caribbean, very often you have an illness, you need to go find Rambo Dashalong. Anybody ever heard of that? A Jamaican said that? Yes. My mother said that a lot growing up. Nicaragua uses that. And of course, especially since COVID, some of these other ones became pretty popular. You must have heard of the Guinea hen weed, fever grass, yeah? And these were the herbs that were often turned to for healing. We see that expression in the Caribbean again. But a lot of people, when they talk about turning to herbs for healing, something my grandma told me, it is not necessarily among the young and hippie. It's really that kind of older generation. Interestingly, when I had COVID the first time, I went to a doctor here on island who was German. And she spoke to me a lot about these sorts of things. This is why the emphasis is on herbalism, not homeopathy, because homeopathy actually originated with the Germans. But the Africans believed that we could use these aspects of nature respectfully and use them to heal. Another thing that is very popular in African religious expression that we see here in the Caribbean is spirit possession. And when we talk about spirit possession, we're not just talking about what happens in the church when you get into spirit, although that was an expression of kind of the African synthesizing, right? What the Africans did was they would continue to practice their own religions by using or covering it under Christianity. So they merged the names of some of their gods with the Christian saints and that sort of thing. There was this need to have their religion survive, and so they gave them new names, sometimes new genders, but it was really an act of survival. So with spirit possession, go back to the previous one, please. We see this whole idea that we could be possessed by a spirit, by a god, but there's also the idea, if you could move on, that we could be possessed by other things, other persons, other beings, that's the word. So Africa talks a lot about, well, it's expressed in the Caribbean, these ways and ways of knowing. And I have about 3 quotations here, one from Jamaican, Erna Brodba. She says there are ways and ways of knowing. Erna Brodba is a Jamaican historian, what is she not? Anthropologist, novelist,
And then we have Toni Morrison. I wanted to bring in the American too, because we're talking about expressions of Africa in the Caribbean, but it's really expressed throughout the African diaspora. So everywhere that Africans were trafficked during the slave period, we have these expressions. And she said that Black people believe in superstition and magic. Yeah? We believe that there are beings that will manifest themselves to us. Not necessarily something we can understand with our five senses, but it's almost like a higher science. Some of us would say higher science. Science, yeah, but there's higher science, other ways of knowing. So there's the idea, for example, of your grandma dream you. We've had that. Grandma, in other words, you go to bed one night, you're visited by your grandma who passes on some kind of, some kind of good information. Yes. And this is a kind of possessing. So grandma visits me and her ancestral spirit imparts some vital information. I'll tell you this memory from my childhood. I have an uncle who died that I never met, but I remember as a child, the first time I met these cousins, because somebody kept dreaming for a week that Uncle so-and-so was saying that he's cold. Uncle so-and-so had died years ago. But Uncle so-and-so kept dreaming to this person and saying, I'm cold, make me warm. And they went to investigate the graveyard, and what they found was that there was a massive hole towards the side, something had eroded. So Uncle was cold, Uncle needed to be covered, and we had this family gathering where we retombed him, basically. Right? So this idea of hello, please, don't dismiss it. This is what one of my teachers said to me in A-levels. Don't dismiss something just because you don't believe it. Yes? So that's one way. Since we're talking about this whole idea of possession, notice that the possession can be by spirits or it can be by an ancestor. In the African worldview, there's a whole idea that the dead is geographically here. So there is a symbiotic relationship between the departed and the living. And so, of course, ancestral worship is something that is done. And we see this in the Caribbean in some subtle ways. Because I have here the pouring of libations. Now, I'm not sure if our students know what that is, but you might have seen old people, I'm saying old again, who might be drinking an alcoholic beverage, for example. Actually, it's any kind of beverage. What do? Pour a little bit on the ground. So this is the way of acknowledging the ancestral presence, right? You're being respectful to the old people because they're still with us and they're a guide, they're a protector. Feed them what?
White rice.
I don't know that.
Yes.
Feed them with white rice. I only know about the beverages, but Maureen will always know more. And then, of course, if you're in the Caribbean and you know about death and burials, certainly you've heard about Nine Night. Yeah. Certainly you've heard about Dead Yard, Nicaragua. Yes? But I can only reference the Jamaican Nine Night, which has become quite a party these days. But originally, it's a wake that's held, and usually on the 9th night, which is the last night, the next day is going to be the burial, the funeral, then you would have the spirit of the departed passing through. And so there is a whole celebration, set of activities. We don't go through the detailed activities like we should anymore, but there would be a table set up for the spirit to come and have his fill. There would be someone asking who goes there. There'd be questioning, communicating, and that's the way of just honoring the ancestor. And at the end,
you throw him out.
You have to throw him out, so he or she doesn't return. So there would be after the person. And you can't say, what can't you say? You can't say his name, but you also at the end can't say, good to see you, come back. Kind of, you have to make sure he's left out in the dark. So very often people put an X on the door, or it is that you change the clothes around, flip the mattress on the bed, rearrange the furniture. So is this just Jamaica? Nicaragua? No. Thank you. So it's not just something that's expressed in Jamaica. I do know that here in Cayman, I don't know if I've ever seen or heard of a 9 Night here.
And he has a wife, she has to wear a red underwear.
Yes. If it's your spouse, isn't it fabulous? So if it is your spouse, especially the male has died, the female has to wear red underwear and has to get to the graveyard, the burial site, before the hearse does.
Yeah.
And if, for example, this is a grandma who has passed and a child used to sleep with that grandma, you'd have to pass the child over the grave a couple of times. So there are all kinds of things that we do that look weird, sound like superstition, really looks like uncivilization, but these had an origin. And for me, they are beautiful cultural expressions. We also see that in the African worldview, nature is very important. And I have a question here. What do we know about cotton trees? Very people under cotton tree?
There's another thing that we do. There's another thing that we do.
Yes.
Like just for them to make sure they stay at the burial ground.
Oh, we're no
You
longer
push pin. You use pin and push under the foot bottom
of the corpse.
Yes. So that way
They know that one. So you see, there's always something to learn. Thank you, Miss Marie. But cotton trees were known to be duppy. Duppies live in cotton trees. So we walk every evening, and I'm always pointing to the cotton tree. There's one just across the road because duppies live under cotton trees. I don't think Trinidadians say duppy. Ghosts. They're very refined. Ghosts. But in Jamaica we say duppy. And then so what we see though is this is still descended from the African belief, because very often trees were the dwelling places of spirits. They weren't, it wasn't scary. This was where, oh, I'm so sorry, Shaquille, you wanted to say something. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so the cotton tree, I remember this from being a child, that we had to be very careful around cotton trees because spirits inhabited there. And then I wanted to bring in nature, what they believed. How we treat animals in Western civilization is completely different from how they're treated in the African worldview, because the animals are respected. Yeah, the animals are highly valued. They are used in Western civilization as lab rats, as they're hurt very often, or they're pets, or they're food. And of course, some of this applies in Africa as well. But I wanted to point out that even in the instances when sacrifices had to be made, then it was with a kind of respect that the animal was giving its life for the greater good, right? So it was done very carefully. And I have a question here. Again, it's a Jamaica thing, and please jump in if it happens in your country or not. I ask here, what happens when we have a new house? Like a new house has been built, and before you move into it, you do what?
White fowl. Sprinkle the blood.
Please don't use fowl. It's a white chicken. A white chicken is slaughtered, and the blood is sprinkled. The sacrifice for cleansing. Very often white rum is used as well. You see, Jamaicans will use white rum for any excuse. But in terms of the African worldview as it ties in with nature, it's usually a chicken that is used. Thank you. Go on, please. And then you can't talk about African religion without talking about the drums. The drums are, I wanted to put in a video here just to show just the Africans, how they manifest in the presence of drumming. But drums in African religious expressions are extremely potent. And what you will see here is that they're central to the religious practices. It is the drum that invokes the spirit. And it is the drum that guides the possession of spirits. So you will see that, I quote a particular text here, where Erna Brodba in her novel said, then came the drums. And then there's a pause, there's a sense of expectation, because it is profound, it's hypnotic, it's transformative. So popular, so inspiring. Please go on. So very impacting is this drum that it is likened to a heartbeat. Maureen Warner Lewis says it is a mighty heart because it gives that life force to African religious expressions. As a matter of fact, one of the things we know is that the drum was believed to speak. And it is for this reason that during slavery, these drums were actually banned. Because the slaves would use the drums to communicate, and the colonizers had no idea of the language of the drums. So they never knew what was happening, but they would very often realize, oh, drumming takes place, Then there's a revolt 2 days later, just hypothetically. And so they realized that there was some communication happening. And so the drums were banned. And if you go to a number of churches, I think it's changing now, but churches in the Caribbean at one point, it wasn't the thing to have drums, right? Because even though it was banned for particular reasons under slavery, we still have a lot of the archaic things happening, even though it's no longer relevant. And when I thought of this, I wanted to just quote one of our French writers, Simone Schwarzbart of Guadeloupe. I'm just trying to show that wherever you look at in the Caribbean, there is some sort of expression of this. And she very often evokes this idea of the drum, but she uses it to be symbolic of survival. Because a lot of the African expressions that were retained during slavery, even when they were covered over and camouflaged, they were really to enable survival. So she says, and I'm giving my daughter this when she goes off to college, no time soon. Be a fine little negress, a real drum with two sides. Let life bang and thump, but keep the underside always intact, right? So this idea that you can beat on, but underneath I'm preserving what is important. And this is what they use to survive, all right? So we did say that it speaks to, it was banned, and it led me, this has nothing to do with religion, well, it's kind of-ish, but it made me think about other things that might have been banned under slavery. And I wasn't sure if it was illegal. That's when I consulted my wonderful son over there. And I found it interesting because I remember this as a child, and I wanted to check if it was still so in Jamaica today. And I had two persons, Dr. Carol being one, confirming yes. So we weren't allowed to buy kerosene oil after 6 p.m. When I grew up in Jamaica up to about age 5, my family did not have electricity. We had the home sweet home lamp. And so you needed kerosene for this. And I remember my mother would say to my older sisters, hurry and get the kerosene because it's almost 6 o'clock. You weren't allowed to. Burials, I'm going to tell you why in a minute. Burials, even after, it doesn't happen in Trinidad. Burials, burials, even after 6 we can't bury, even today. Yes, I contacted a minister to be sure. And the response he gave, because I was trying to find out if it's a legal thing or just a cultural practice that resonates. And he said it is actually stated that you cannot bury after 6 p.m. because it's the start of a new day, yes, right? And you cannot marry after 6 p.m. because I can't remember why.
It requires witness. Remember, marriage and burial requires witness.
Yes.
And it night sets. But these laws are before we had.
Yes.
Right. Because legally those two require witnesses.
Yeah, but why do they still linger is my concern, you know? So you usually have these, the belief, one school of thought, is that it was the time when the slaves would get together and plan revolts. Yes?
Because I did research around that.
Good.
It was part of the slave code during that particular period, because they were afraid that when the slaves gathered,
that's what I said.
Run away.
Yes.
There was a chance of uprising.
Yes, that's exactly what I just said. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the confirmation. So this is why I'm saying, why does it still linger? Because there's no such concern now, but it is, go back please, it is still a concern and it still lingers. Supposedly because there would be uprising, there'd be slaves running away. So they weren't allowed to gather after a certain time. I wanted to just point to the Cayman law. So this is actually law. Yes, Lloydie? This is actually law where this is on the Cayman books now. All right? So we have a lot of North Americans, I'll use them as an example, foreigners who will come and want a midnight marriage on the beach side. And when I did public relations in Jamaica, I would say to them, you can get married, but it's not legal. So they could go through just have it as a ceremonial representative of what they want to do, but it was not legal. And it remains on the Cayman book, so be aware of that. Thank you. And so we go on to the language. How much time do I have? Not much, oh dear. So language is another way in which we hear African and see African retentions in the Caribbean. I have a question here, broken or derived, because Miss Lou, who is the Jamaican poet and cultural icon, and I want to also dare to say the woman who said to us in the Caribbean, it's okay to write the way you speak, Miss Lou asked this question in one of her performances. She actually had corruption or derivation. And she said, you know, the theory is that the English language is derived from Latin, Greek, Italian, all these different languages. But for example, the Jamaican patois is a corruption of English. And a lot of us growing up in Jamaica, we would have been told, you speak broken English, speak properly. And so this whole idea is our language actually broken, or are we still continuing our African languages? So if you could go on. I want to emphasize that the language actually is believed to denote civilization. So again, you're colonized, the colonizer's language is superior. Yours is therefore inferior, right? And this is expressed even in like Shakespeare's play The Tempest, where I won't go into literature. So we see it, so the colonizer gabbles, and the colonized gabbles, and the colonizer speaks. So this whole idea, and I remember one of the things I said, there's a belief that in some ways it's still inferior. So if I stand around and talk patois with my Jamaican family or friends, we're talking broken English. And if we are in certain settings, more formal, auspicious settings, it's not the ideal, right? But Louise Bennett said, not Nogoso. She said, when we look at our language, it's good word. Yeah. There are good authentic words they derived as well. And so she gives examples in that presentation. Yeah. And I was asking up here, what is your nation language? Because Brathwaite Bajan said, we're not calling it Creole or dialect or a derivative or anything. It's a language and we're embracing it as such. But Louise Bennett gave these examples. She said, nyam, we use that a lot in Jamaica, doti. And of course, that's a corruption of dirty. It's not, she said, puto, puto, poto, poto, right? And bankra. And these are actual words from the tree, T-R-I, but pronounced tree language. And bankra, go back please. Bankra means basket, poto, poto, muddy, yes, something that is potty, kind of. The texture, dirty, of course, it's just the ground. So if you know Bob Marley said, rain and fall, but oh, you Jamaicans. Rain and fall, but dirty top, and it really means the ground is hard. It's not a corruption of dirty. Yes. One of the things you have to go back, please. One of the things we also know is that the African worldview speaks of an oral tradition. And within this oral tradition, wisdom is enshrined. So we have the griot. A lot of people will say griot, who is a West African storyteller, singer, musician, and oral historian. And these persons can usually trace your family or genealogy orally for years and years and years. Read Alex Haley's Roots, very nicely expressed there. When we look at the African oral tradition, we see the expressions in folktales, proverbs, etc. And I'm running now. So folktales, for example, everybody in the Caribbean knows about Anansi. Yes. But Anansi originated in Africa. Yes? Anansi is actually in some places of Africa considered a god. And he is revered as a trickster spirit. So he, of course, talks about, is usually used to express trickery and an ability to survive. So the Africans were able to survive slavery because they tricked, outsmarted their colonizers quite a bit. So this whole trickery that is associated with Anansi is very much there, or descended from Africa. We have Legba. Legba isn't very popular in Jamaica. I was happy to see this one because it speaks to some other Caribbean countries. But Legba is actually an African, West African ancestor god. He is considered the keeper of the crossroads, a guardian of the crossroads, and you very often had to ask his permission to help you with choosing the right way to go. We have an expression of Legba in the Caribbean who is, move on please. Papa Bois. Yes. Do you know about Papa Bois? Yeah. Which country speaks the Papa Bois? Because we don't in Jamaica very much. I think this is Trinidad, Grenada, St. Lucia. Confirm? No?
I don't know about speaking.
No. In terms of, is Papa Boy a part of your folk tale? What about, and St. Lucia, well, you're not St. Lucia, but I thought you might know. Derek Walcott has him in his story, in his dramatic piece, Tijon and his brothers. So you would have met Papa Boy, right? In Tijon and his brothers. So this is an African expression of another folktale character in the Caribbean. Proverbial expressions. We don't go a day without our parents throwing that at us. Proverbs they're just words of wisdom encased in little expressions, and they preserve wisdom. They were often used by the older to teach the younger. Move on, please. And I have some African proverbs here. Why isn't it? Yeah, I underlined the second one just for Dr. Liv. I thought he would like that. Before you go to the first after what killed the husband. When you read these African proverbs, you hear the wisdom in them.
I like 3. I like number 3.
Oh yes. I know it's humorous, but do you hear the wisdom? Right?
Number 1. So,
yes. I wanted to end with number 4 because it is so very expressive of one very popular proverb in the Caribbean. Which one does that remind you of? A person who sells eggs should not start a fight in the market. So that goes to it now. So the Caribbean proverbs, I actually started with that. It is very popular. I don't know which Caribbean country doesn't have some version of this. And this is the beauty about the proverbs. Even if it's not expressed the very way in your country, there's a version of it. I have the explanations. Just go, Dr. Erica. Chicken Mary Hawk Lanier. Again, these are Jamaican proverbs largely. Cottonmouth kill cock. Yes, the final one. He'll never go before toe. I'd never heard this one before, so I wanted to include it. He'll never go before toe, meaning you deal with the important things first. And the final thing I'm going to talk with you about, and then shut up, is riddles. Riddles are what we grew up on. We would always ask each other riddles, try to figure things out, and this is what happened in the African cultures as well. They would again, it was didactic. It was supposed to teach a lesson. You're supposed to figure something out. And again, it was the older generation to the younger. So we have again some riddles here. These are all African riddles. And you're supposed to think on it, figure it out. I was hoping to give you this at the start and then you try to get the answers by the time I get to the end, but I knew you wouldn't listen to me anymore, so I decided not to do that. But can you guess the answer for any of these? African riddles, also expressed in various ways in the Caribbean. What is it that when it falls does not make a noise? Night, yes. If it falls standing but runs on its belly, what is it?
A snake?
False. Number 2. What did you say? A river falls?
Waterfall. Rain.
Rain. I am neither inside nor outside, but I am in every house. Who am I?
Keyhole.
Ear.
A door. Good job. But some Africans up in here, man. 2 doors are opening and closing at the same time, but they are not doors of my house. What are they? Matches box.
Doors.
2 doors. I don't know if the matches box having doors. Well, that's what the answer for this book. Eyes. So they're supposed to be interesting, they're supposed to be entertaining, but they're to make you think, which is always a good thing. Kind of. I wanted to just emphasize here, guys, this is the takeaway I'd like you to have. The differences of races is no evidence of superiority or of inferiority. We express ourselves differently in the Caribbean. We express ourselves differently Caribbean versus European versus American, whatever it might be. There's none that is inherently superior nor inferior. It's just different strokes for different folks. And I think it's beautiful that the ways you are different offers an opportunity for me to learn. And of course, the final statement here from, again, an American author, Paul Marshall. The thing is, we have had more than enough attempts to eradicate our culture in the Caribbean. It's been banned, it's been made illegal, we've been whipped for it, etc. But we find that even after centuries, these memories do not go away. Please continue to teach your children, siblings, about Africa, these stories, all of these things that make us who we are. All right?
Come on, give these two speakers another round of applause, please. Thank you, Doctors Durham and Cooper. We don't have much time. Don't leave if you don't have to. But we need to put to them a few questions. Do you have any questions? Yes, please, Shaquille, go right ahead.
Yes.
Dr. Cooper.
Why did you say we can't buy kerosene after 6?
Because it was used to burn the plantations. I'm sorry, I did say I'd get back to it. Yeah. So if you acquired it after 6, it was what they used to burn the cane fields.
Okay. Thank you. Any other question? Yes, sir. Go right ahead, please.
So the patois and the sort of African culture, is this taught in schools? And should it be?
Erica, please respond.
Okay. As Dr. Cooper pointed out earlier, there's a notion that the standard form of the language is what we should promote because we want to ensure that our students are able to communicate at all levels.
Yep.
So the idea is you don't have to teach the Jamaican creole because we're gonna talk it. So you have to teach the standard form of the language. But in modern days, the idea is we should help our students to express themselves in their first language and then do the translation. I could tell you one joke that happened with one of my friends. She was teaching social studies. And she was referring to one of the soap operas, and she said, all right, what kind of social messages could we say now about, was it not a one of them? And the student said, say probably Alexis can't sleep in bed at night. And she said, all right, say that in English now. And the child said, say probably. So we encourage them, we encourage children to speak the language that you know, and then we'll translate or have you translate so that you can move to that level. But there's still resistance being taught on all sides because it is broken English, it is non-standard, it is, because of Blake, Alexis is unable to speak in her bed at night.
Okay.
But yes, we have that tussle that is going on.
Excellent. A follow-up question, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so in Wales and Ireland, they're so scared about these parts of the culture dying off, specifically the Welsh language and Gaelic language, that most schools will teach both languages and they're official subjects. And I'm not sure that's what should be an official subject.
One of the reasons that it is difficult is that there are various written forms that are difficult to write and difficult to read. Easy to talk because we talk all the time, but it is difficult to write and to pronounce. So that is probably the reason.
Remember too, that we're using patois as the example, but it's not the only Creole. All over, we have the French Creole, Garifuna, all of that. Miss Felicia was just saying that in
St. Lucia, they have a patois dictionary, but it also is one of the first in Caribbean to recognize patois as official language.
So different Caribbean countries are doing different things. In Jamaica, we have a patois Bible. We have songs that are complete in patois, etc., but it's just not.
Excellent. Let's get into some more questions. Let's start with Stuart before you. Go right ahead, please. Yeah.
Well, I'm a Nicaraguan, so in my country, the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, we are autonomous. So because of that, the government allow us to teach broken English, what we call Creole English, right, in schools. And we also, in the Garifuna, because we have a large Garifuna community, they're also allowed to teach Garifuna in school so they can preserve their culture, which their culture are more preserved in that area. They're more preserved than other, because we have other ethnic race, like we have Mosquito, Sumo, Rama, and Garifuna. So their culture is more preserved than those other cultures. So yeah, so it's a beautiful thing.
Excellent. We'll take Mrs. Gale and then Ms. Opa. Go right ahead, Mrs. Gale.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. I really did learn some things, although I grew up in Jamaica, a lot of that I did not. I'm curious, can I eat that white fowl after I bless the house?
I would not recommend it.
I don't think so. Not at
Mrs. Gail, that should be on your own now.
Yeah, I think the idea of it being used to cleanse means that whatever evil would be is now absorbed. So I do not recommend it. No.
Your own risk. I'm going to take Miss Cooper and then we take the students. Go ahead, please.
Just an observation, as a question. For the Cayman students, there are two words that is used commonly in Cayman, which is of African origin. Uno, like uno, it's a Tibo word. Una. Right. Una and uno, both used in the Caribbean, are both Igbo words for you people. And bobo is actually an Igbo word for friend and brother.
Thank you very much. We're going to go right ahead, young man.
I just wanted to ask who made the thing with the island?
You mean answer? He doesn't like to answer, but that's fine.
I went on an African site and I did some research and it gave me the result and the answer. So I'm sure, remember now, there are different versions of this, so it might just be. It's just I didn't get it for the matches box.
I want to ask a question to Dr. Durham. Coming to you, go ahead very quickly.
I just want to find out, any of you guys who are not Jamaican, have you had any, have you ever heard of Mr. Brown and the rolling calf? Oh, yes. Have you heard of the rolling calf? Have you heard of Mr. Brown? Have you ever heard of Mr. Brown? Dr. Smith, can you tell him about Mr. Brown?
I'm afraid I'm not able to, but I know rolling calf. But
I know about rolling calf.
You ever heard of Mr. Brown?
No, just rolling calf.
To keep us in our homes, we were told that you do not stray, because there is a coffin, a 3-foot coffin. No, we're not talking about the black man. There is a 3-foot coffin going around asking for Mr. Brown. And if you happen to be around and they can't find Mr. Brown, you will be the one who will be the coffin.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to take, but I want to ask Dr. Durham a question too. So go ahead, please, and make it fast. But time is going fast, yes.
Does everyone in here believe that OBS should be carved? That it should be transported down to the new generation, right? Because it's going to get lost if they don't teach it.
That's what we can do.
Okay, guys. So. Okay.
I think that because of the negative connotations and associations, that is the reason that it is being banned and outlawed. Even now in Jamaica, there are questions about taking it off the books as illegal because it is being practiced in many and various forms. There are all sorts of fortune tellers and people promoting and they're advertising. So whereas Maya was always positive and good, Obia was always negative, it's a bad thing. So maybe that's the reason that people won't want to embrace it as something to be taught and perpetuated.
But I believe it should be taught. I believe it should get lost. Right? You should learn. I'm not saying they should use it, but they should know it. Because in my country, on my side, we use a lot of midwives, right? There's all type of midwives. God knows how blessed we were to have those.
Last question, please. Oh, thank you very much. Dr. Durham, your question. And the last one for Dr. Cooper. What is the current state of the reparation movement in the Caribbean? Just because, tell us what you mean by reparations quickly, and where are we with that right now?
We are nowhere with it right now.
Right.
There has been advocacy, so many of you should know Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, leading that charge via the CARICOM Reparations Committee, but it basically means being compensated for the institution of slavery. Right. So that conversation, of course, it would be different depending on where you are, and especially because we have so many non-independent Caribbean territories that continue to experience certain types of colonialism.
Right, and there's a website on the CARICOM.
On the CARICOM. Yeah.
You can go and educate yourself. Dr. Stephanie, my last question to you. You spent quite a bit of time talking about the African view that reality is quite complicated. There are multiple realities. Do you think the emphasis on current empirical research, you have to do research, evidence, that's reality? Do you think that emphasis is taken away from humanity to some extent?
In some ways, because I'm going to answer this by going into romanticism, because the romantics thought that it's very important for you to tap into what is natural, that it shouldn't be too structured and scientific, because that is what is authentic. For me, as an individual, I think that's the way to go, but then I'm a romantic. So it all depends on your inclination, your leaning. The scientific certainly has value, and for those who, for an academic setting, we absolutely need that. But I don't think, again, the inferior to superior, I just think it's another tranche, another way of getting the answers that you need.
Thank you very much. Give a hand, everybody. And before you leave, remember on Friday, we want to see a Sea of Africa at a time. All right, so come and enjoy Friday. Mrs. Robinson, I want to see you in the Africa at a time. Take care, guys.
Thanks, guys. Remember to put your name in the chat. Put your name